think it's absolutely essential when you feel that creative fire inside to be true to that. Doesn't mean it's going to save the world, but it might save you, and that could be just as important.
Welcome to episode 19 of the Future is Beautiful podcast. I'm your host, Amisha. We have had a little issue with our microphones. They appear to have been damaged whilst we were travelling earlier this year, and not to have reacted very well to the humidity in Ubud, Bali. And so this means there is some impact to the sound quality of the interviews that were done over those days. The conversation we're sharing today is one of them. It's not terrible, but some wind-like noises come in halfway through. William and I arranged to re-record remotely, him from the States and me from London. And then after discussing it, we decided that we didn't want to affect the authenticity of this conversation by trying to recreate it from different locations. As you know, all the interviews to date have been face-to-face, and this is important to us for the level of intimacy it creates. We thought about just redoing the second part, but felt that we'd lose the beauty of this moment, which was indeed special. We asked some listeners in our online group what they felt. It was divided. We make this for you, so please do write to us and let us know if it bothers you whilst we're deciding what to do with the other affected interviews. We are also crowdfunding to help us replace the microphones and run the show generally. If you can support us, visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community. My guest this week is William Etundi. We met through mutual friends in Bali earlier this year and immediately hit it off. William is a true creative and an activist. His work has been featured in the pages of Vogue, ID magazine, Paper magazine and more, with the New York Times proclaiming him an impresario of the underground. In 2012, he launched SeeMe, an international artist network that grew to over 1 million members. He's also the founder and creative director of You Are So Lucky, one of the most sought-after tickets in New York City. In this conversation, we talk about race, belonging, creativity, experiences that change us, political activism, and how to influence culture. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by William Etundi, and we're here in Bali, sitting in the heat, taking a little time out in softer lands from New York, London lifestyles.
Yeah.
And my first question is around the experiences that you're creating right now in New York City. So you're working with You're So Lucky. Mm-hmm. Can you share a bit about what those experiences are?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So the work I'm most currently focused on is a project called You Are So Lucky, which is actually something I conceived of almost a decade ago when I was doing these big underground events, and it felt like that era for me was coming to an end, which I'm happy to elaborate on if you are interested. But it was kind of the closing of one era and the beginning of another, and I had a name and a concept. The name was You Are So Lucky, and the concept was how to create a moment and an experience that was so clear and so deeply a celebration of the city itself that people would come out the other side and feel that they're so lucky to be in the city, to be with the people that they're with, to have experienced what we all kind of came through together, and to kind of leave people with more than what they came in with, was the idea. And that's where the name comes from. And that concept has evolved a lot to where it is now. But the core, I think, is still there, and people seem to really appreciate it. So that's kind of what the intention is.
So through experience, connecting to a sense of gratitude.
Exactly.
For being able to be part of such an incredible city and where so many incredible people gather.
Exactly. And like really like building a place where people can connect in a way that isn't always available to us in our day-to-day lives. So something that's kind of extraordinary, and there's a bit of spectacle which can spark conversation, but we try to create an experience that's not so distracted by the spectacle that it doesn't, we try to allow for people to find a place to go hide away and then have a deep conversation, and it's really about creating a container for that conversation that also has music and, there's some drinking and different stuff, but it's really about like the container. And I think that's what makes our experience a little different than a lot of the other stuff that's in New York City, is people feel that. People feel like this freedom and this exploration and this thing where you can have these spontaneous connections with the people you came with, or people you just met, or people you didn't even know that you needed to know, and it all kind of comes together in this very fertile, combustible place.
I'm so interested in how experience design can create space for us to meet different parts of ourselves. So, for example, if you go into a building that is designed badly and there's fake plants everywhere and CCTV and immediately, even if you don't even know that there's CCTV and you don't even necessarily haven't even clocked that the plants are fake, you're taking in so much. We take in so much through our vision and our consciousness, and then immediately something happens in your body, right? You maybe feel more restricted or a bit more protected or a bit angry or something, and it all happens on a subconscious level. And then yet we can create experiences where the opposite happens, and there's space for more connection or for more freedom, like you said. How have you seen experience design work through people?
It really starts from where it's conceived in the inception. So intention means a lot, right? So when you come to building anything, whether it's an experience or a piece of artwork or a piece of media, the intention and where that intention comes from, it starts the tone from the very beginning. And that's why we come here to Bali every year to kind of retouch in with nature, with spirit. I mean, the spiritual landscape here is unlike anything I've seen or experienced anywhere in the world. And this is where the ideas for the next season come from, for both Yourseleki and some other projects that I'm doing. And we kind of plant the seeds of the intention from here, because it is a place that could be so in touch and kind of bringing the energy of the jungle and the green, which is all around us right now, and the water, the monkeys, the spirit, the temples, the snakes, the frogs, the geckos.
And the softness. Of the land.
Yeah. And kind of bringing all that and merging that with kind of the power and dynamic energy of New York City creates something that can be very fertile. And we've been blessed to have this incredible Gilded Age mansion on the edge of the city. That's our main home base for the events that we do. We do 2 events a year within this kind of Yourseleki framework. And it's at this mansion that has this incredible garden. I mean, acres of incredibly gorgeous gardens and grounds, and a 72-room Gilded Age, 3-story mansion. It's a massive, massive house. So out of scale with anything else that we've kind of are able to experience normally like that. It's unimaginable to live in a place of this scale, but really fun to kind of have an adventure within it. And for us, we try to do all that we can, alchemize this kind of the energy that must have built that house, because you can't have a house built of that scale at that time without some dark forces coming together to make it. And you feel that within the structure itself. And alchemizing that structure into something that can be full of life and fun and exploration, and also acknowledging the darker half and playing with those energies, and kind of converting what was a house built for 3 people, a husband, a wife, and a son, and 35 servants, to something that thousands of people can come through and have hopefully a connecting experience. These structures themselves kind of lend to the story and lend to what it can be, and then being really intentional as we're moving through the space, how we're building an experience that can kind of speak to the histories of the space, speak to like the inspirations that come from all around the world that kind of come into the space, and alchemize it in a way that will leave people hopefully like feeling something greater than what they came in with. We do that by just spending a lot of time in the space, really feeling it out, sketching out, thinking about like what the experience will be, how the story will be experienced, and and also creating little secret moments that people will discover that they didn't expect that happens within this wild landscape that we build. So all this kind of comes together to create the wholeness of the experience. And when it comes together well, I think it works well for people.
Beautiful. And it's also like taking people out of where they normally hang out,
exactly,
bringing them into somewhere where there's just like a kind of that element of new experience really opens people. Especially in New York City, where we live in such a linear environment. The grid is so good for efficiency, the street grid. The concrete and steel, like it works very well to create buildings and empires and corporations and all those things. It's not so great for humanness. So for us to be able to like step out of that whole world, come to the edge of the city. I mean, this is just outside of New York City on the north side. And go to a place that's full of like trees and life and like this, mansion with these like crazy ornate rooms that normally you wouldn't ever be allowed to be in, but suddenly you're there and there's performance. It opens up people in a way that's like can be really fun and exciting, and also like I hope in moments pretty profound. Like you're able to like, I can't believe I'm in this place experiencing this thing, and having a conversation that you might otherwise have, because it's just so far removed, so close to the city, but so far removed from like kind of the gridded structure that we've all kind of locked ourselves into.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like we like a different spaces and places, countries, like they bring out something different inside of us. Like we're not the same everywhere we are. Like I like that we're not the same in every relationship, because each relationship is a unique alchemical like force of itself, and so it brings out something different. And it's the same with places. And so taking people into different places has this, this beautiful like impact, like even on a soul level. And we've been talking about being in Bali, and both of us find this a very nourishing place for our soul and for our creativity, and yet also aware of the paradox of, us like city people coming to Bali to chill out, and then how that has impacted the culture of Bali, of Ubud, where we are, but also, and then it gets complicated because it becomes part of the structure where if you just took all that out of the ecosystem in Bali, then the economic system is so like fed through it.
Yeah, it's like, what point is it cultural appropriation or cultural collaboration? At what point is it colonialism? And at what point is it supportive? And, I think about that. I'm not natively from New York. I grew up in California. My father's from Ghana, a place that has a long history of being colonized in some of the ugliest ways. And my mom's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant woman in California, a Protestant minister, actually. And in a lot of ways, everything I do in New York is, appropriation or colonizing or gentrification, whichever word you want to use. I spent my first few years in the city in Harlem, which was incredible. It fed me so deeply, but I was not native to Harlem. Even though I'm brown-skinned, I'm not actually a native Harlem person. Was that gentrification? Like, that was right when Harlem became really gentrified. And I spent a lot of time in Bushwick when Bushwick was super raw, and a lot of the events that we did there, like, are credited with turning Bushwick into a place that's very different than what it was. Whether that's better or worse is like open for a lot of debate. Same thing in Dumbo, same thing in Williamsburg, 20 years ago. And now we're working in Yonkers and bringing energies there that Yonkers has never seen in its entire history. And the city's incredibly excited for us to be there, because they're like, you guys are bringing an energy and attention and focus that's like this town needs to like kind of grow. but also is that, we are stepping on some of the toes of the people up there, which we're trying to be very conscious of. There's some Republican citizens there that don't want people partying in their neighborhood. They want it to be like a quiet, conservative place. And kind of everywhere we go, Bali included, where we are sitting right now, it's this question of like, is this collaboration, is this sharing? How much am I pushing something else out by being here? Or is the place benefited by my presence? And I think a lot of all these things can be true at the same time. And I don't have a solution for how we should be, except that we should be conscious of how we are at every moment we are in a place. And I try to hold on to that, especially here in Bali, which is such a fertile and special, and I don't want to be patronizing and say it's delicate, but it is something that, deserves some respect and soft touch, I guess.
Well, delicate isn't it isn't a criticism. Like, delicacy is beautiful.
Yeah,
like, we use that word for, like, the best food.
Yeah.
And Bali does have this, it's the land of the gods. Like, you can feel it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can also feel the presence of Gung and the...
which is not delicate.
which is not delicate at all. So you get both.
Again, for everyone listening, is a volcano that has been imminently maybe going to explode this year.
Yeah. It leads to the question of, like, where is our land?
Yeah.
And, it's you're like, okay, well, like, you're not even from New York, but it's America, so does that mean that that's okay?
Yeah.
And, I didn't grow up in London. I really don't feel like the town that I grew up in the middle of England is where my life needed to happen, like the whole of it. Like, that's somewhere that my parents lived because jobs took them there. They'd come all the way from India through London, and it's like, well, where does one really have like a right? And I'm putting right in inverted commas because I don't know if such a thing exists. And it's something that I've really been exploring in myself, like my connection, say, to India. But I wasn't born in India, but all of my genetics and ancestry is Indian, and I feel Indian, but I also feel European, like English, London, but like actually I feel probably less European and more part of like a global, network. I've spent a huge amount of time in America in my life. I used to go there for the summers to spend time with my cousins when I was young, and then it's led to all these adventures. So I feel like a big kinship, like with my community in America, and all over, right? And it's like we're living in a very complicated time in that sense, where there is so much movement. So where does one belong? Where does one have rights?
And it feels like one of the most essential questions of this time, especially as the United States is really coming to terms with its racial moment in a way that's been extraordinarily challenged and painful, but also maybe it's been, furthering an arts movement that feels very vital and fertile. And it's interesting because, like, if you take away all the gentrification, if you take away all cultural appropriation or sharing, whichever word you want to use, and take away all, the colonizing and all the way that's horrible and destructive, but if you take all of that away, then we're just these tribalized, peoples totally separate from everything else. And like that also does not feel like the reality of this planet or the future. And I'm not sure where the balance is between one extreme and the next, but I think I'm starting to feel that we're more of like a global community, and there's a lot of exchange that's complex and like has things we need to be careful of, but can be mutually beneficial. And in the long run, those exchanges do kind of evolve the human experiment a step further towards something. And I think there is a purpose to this experiment that we're all here doing. As humans and the plants and all the things, we're all kind of on this living planet that I think is going towards something of some kind of universal intention. And the tribalized kind of fantasy. I don't think is real. I do think we need to be. There is something to preserving culture and celebrating culture and celebrating our uniqueness, but that doesn't mean it has to always be this like fierce separation. And I think for me, it's like that's essential because I am mixed race. My father is from Ghana. He lives in Ghana now, and he lived in the United States for many years, but he's there now, and I'm half Ghanaian and half white. And it's essential to who I am that that there is a coming together that's, greater than the separation. And I don't know if that my life is that, I hope. Do you know what I mean?
What does that mean, like this coming together?
I think the best that we can hope for is greater connection, and kind of a collaborative spiraling up. There's some philosophies and certain religious leaders who think that, the evolution of humanity is about this kind of imperfect spiral that kind of meanders its way upwards towards something. It's not a perfect progression. There's pitfalls and there's sideways movements and there's ups and downs, but the general trend line is to kind of move up in this slow sweeping spiral that continues forward. And I think that spiral is helped by this kind of collaborative thing, whether it's two individuals or two cultures or two countries or whatever's coming together to kind of produce something that's greater than the individual parts. And I'm choosing to believe that that's true. And I think, myself and other mixed race people are an embodiment of that. And also cities like London and New York that are such a cross-cultural exchange, I think, are an embodiment of that. And it doesn't mean that there's not incredible loss. The displaced peoples in New York in particular is tragic over history. There used to be a land of Native Americans, and I don't know a single Native American person who's, from that area. And the reason is because most of them were killed along the way. So it comes with great tragedy and sacrifice, but I hope that, it leads to a greater good. And I hope that, our presence here in Bali is like a part of that story. That's my hope, and like that's the intention that I come to these places with. And also the intention of all the different things we bring into our events kind of come with that similar intention.
It's beautiful. How has it been for you understanding the Ghanaian part of your nature and your ancestry?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently. Growing up, African culture and African American culture was not celebrated in a way that I could identify with. I was raised in a white family, in white schools, mostly white friends, and I was never not proud of my African heritage, but it was not something that I felt was celebrated in the world. There was very few icons I could look to that I could personally identify with. There was, people out there, there were, myths and things, but, in school you're taught that Africa is this continent that most Americans think of as a country that's just like mired in poverty and war and challenges and problems and tragedy. And it wasn't until I first went to Ghana with my family, with my father's family, that I kind of saw the truth of it. And there's incredible challenges, incredible poverty, but it's also like incredible strength and beauty there, resilience, and a lot more happening artistically, architecturally, economically than what I think a lot of Americans are aware of. And that was a shock to see just how much life and forward movement there is there. It's not as backwards as the history books make it out to be. What was a bigger shock, though, was going to Ghana the first time was how I was received by the people, including my family. The first time meeting a whole half of my lineage, including grandparents and cousins and uncles and aunts. And there's a word there, abrone, which is almost perfectly synonymous with gringo.
Mm-hmm.
It means white outsider. And depending on the context of how it's used, it could be an insult or a term of endearment, or it's used to kind of both, it's always something where you're separate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's never a word that's used to pull you closer. And I was 22 years old, traveling to Ghana for the first time, just really experiencing the part of my, my homeland, so to speak. And everywhere I went there, I was a Brone. I was not seen as like a light-skinned person of African descent. I was seen completely, absolutely as a white person.
How did that feel?
It was super confusing, because it was confusing on many levels. One, it was just so unexpected for me and my whole family. It was kind of funny at first to my family. It wasn't that funny for me, but I think it was so uncomfortable. Like, my father just chose to be kind of, had this detached amusement around it. We'd go to the market and I'd be surrounded by people trying to sell me, trinkets and things. And like the rest of my family was just invisible. We'd be walking down the street and people would be calling from across, this is 18 years ago, people would be calling from across the street, like, a brone, and like just it was like I was like a visiting dignitary. Every room I was in, every street corner, every place, to a pretty extreme level. Now it's less so because there's more foreign investment and there's more people of different races in Ghana, but then it was pretty extraordinary. So much so when I went to my father's village, my father was born in a very poor village outside of Kumasi. He was born onto a dirt floor, and we came back to his village. It was a big moment. The whole village came out to greet us. A great aunt, who we call grandmother, was there, who still lives, she's 90 years old, still lives in the village, was greeting us and greeting each person in my family with this great celebration and energy, and going down the line from my half-sister, who's, full African heritage, but, lived in the States. She had purple hair at the time. She was going through a punk rock phase. She was 13 years old. No one looked at her twice. My father, my stepmother, comes to me and looks at me with fear, with real fear, and asks my father, who brought the Abrone? Who is this white man here? Mm. And my father's like, this is your grandson. And she's like, it's not my grandson. And it was heartbreaking. Like, I came, halfway across the world to learn about my African heritage and get in touch with some deep root. And in this ironic way, I actually got more in touch with the fact that I was as much half white as half African. And just owning that and being with that, and also owning the privilege of that, because in that same trip, in that same village, I was surrounded by young school children everywhere. It's like Bill Clinton walking through the village. There's 50 kids around me at every moment, pulling at my pants legs, speaking English to me in their best American accents, and being really excited to show me their school and everything else. And again, like, my rest of my family was invisible, but they were so excited to show this, white man who came to their village everything that they had been learning, and feeling the alienation and the privilege and the complexity and the complex history and the colonial history and all those things all at once. And my head was spinning by the time I was flying back home. And I think part of me is still digesting that, what that is. And I think, even in New York, I feel those kind of complex, conflicting experiences.
Yeah, it's funny with the labels. And I remember I was volunteering with kids in a shantytown in Peru, like 15 years ago. And the kids kept calling me Gringa Negra, which means, black woman tourist. And they were so confused, and it was like a term of endearment and confusion. And they kept drawing pictures of like them and me in black paint and giving them to me and being like, Gringa Negra, Gringa Negra. And I was like, and for me, it was this real moment of actually having grown up in very white culture, generally the only non-white person in my school, in any room that I was in, maybe one other. And then suddenly I found myself, having just left school in South America, and then this whole thing of like, it being like an endearment thing, because there was there's something about you that's more like me. And And for me, it was confusing because first it had to like confront this thing that I was different to the other people that I was with, who I thought I was the same as. And then also it opened up this whole world for me where being brown was a bridge, like rather than a thing that set me back, which is what I'd experienced through my, like, not, you know, racism. It's anyone that is not white has experienced so much racism. It's like you don't even talk about it. It's like it just happens constantly, and it's part of the world that we live in, and it plays out in subtle and not so subtle ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for me, this moment of being like, oh wow, like there's actually like a whole half of the world that where actually this could be something that is positive, that allows me to connect more. That was really empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this time, it's like a really fertile moment for that too. And it's interesting, you know, this is 2018, in the early spring, and the politics in the United States are a clusterfuck.
Mm-hmm.
There's no better word to describe it. It's like,
we're getting explicit with this episode now.
It's a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
In so many ways, especially with leadership and racial politics and all this stuff. And at the same time, there's this like really incredible fertile moment in Black American culture, unlike anything that I've seen in my lifetime. Kendrick Lamar was just awarded the Pulitzer Prize, which is incredible, and created this whole conversation that's been really fertile and exciting. You know, Beyonce is one of the most loved performers, celebrities that in a generation. It's rare for someone to be so universally revered in the way that she is. And this film, Black Panther, just took the country by storm in a way that really amazed me. It's the #1 film, and it's, you know, I went and saw it in, when we went to Thailand. I actually saw it in Bangkok, which was an interesting experience, because it's the clearest celebration of African heritage that I have ever seen in pop culture in my life. And I've been looking for it because I'm of African heritage, and it was such a revelation. And I could see how and why it's been such a revelation for so many people, Black, white, and brown, in the United States. And, you know, it's such a full-throated celebration of its, you know, of its Blackness, of its African heritage. And I wonder if those two things are related, if, you know, the political kind of confusions have opened up a powerful moment for culture to like fill that vacuum. If the legacy of Barack Obama is this new proud moment for peoples that used to think of themselves as lesser than or outsider, or all those things that, you know, people like you and I, maybe in ways subtle and not so subtle, have been told our entire lives. I don't know, it's interesting. I've been really observing it. It's interesting observing it from Asia for this winter, with all these things happening kind of all at once in the United States. It feels like a profound moment, and it's been awesome to kind of witness right now. You know, something that I've found some empowerment from.
Mm. Yeah, it's things are definitely stirring, and then yet when we connect back to the history, it's like whoa.
Yeah.
It's so deep and so dark.
Yeah. It is absolutely deep and dark, and life builds on, you know, and it's not, you know, it's an acknowledging of the dark history and building into what we hope is a brighter future.
Mm. A beautiful one.
I hope so. And I think, you know, all of us who are creators, that's like what we do. We try to alchemize kind of these histories and build forward into a future. And I wonder, you know, like my own work and what I do is I haven't really acknowledged creatively in any kind of explicit ways or my African heritage. You know, it's my work doesn't come from, you know, that place, and I'm reevaluating that and kind of evaluating why that has been for me. You know, it's created kind of I think it's a really core question for myself that I'm looking at right now. like what my heritage means into like the work and how I present things in the world and the conversations that I create, which, you know, I've just been outside of that conversation almost entirely.
Mm-hmm. And also, does it have to?
Yeah, does it have to?
You did a lot of really interesting creative activism, political activism events in your 20s. Can you share a little bit about those events and what inspired them and where you feel like the place for those kind of interventions is now?
Yeah, I mean, my political activism and thinking started when I was a child. When my mom went to seminary when I was 8 years old, and that's where ministers go to become ministers. It's like a college for priests. I was in San Francisco Bay Area in Marin County, extremely progressive seminary, and it's where I kind of was able to understand that people can create change in all these different ways. The first Iraq War was happening, and there was incredible protests around the Bay Area that I was able to participate in. My mom took me out of school to go to protests, and I saw direct action for the first time. And I remember being on the streets of San Francisco, seeing people getting arrested with my mom, and I was like, "Mom, we have to do this." And she's like, "You're definitely not doing this. You're going to school tomorrow." I was just probably thinking a little bit like, "What have I done?" But those seeds that she planted in that time were profound, and the energies of that era. And my mom's first church was in the Castro district, back when the Castro was, you know, really proudly and powerfully a gay district. And there's a lot of men and women in that church who were there every Sunday, and there for holidays. We had special Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners because a lot of those men could not go back to their families, and the church became their family. And seeing the power of the Pride Parade and what it means to have something that's kind of so powerfully celebratory and meaningful and you know, pregnant with activism and message and movement, whether it's around you know, gay rights and AIDS activism and all the different things, and reclaiming a neighborhood and, like, you know, claiming a culture. So that's kind of where a lot of the energies came from. And when I set out on my own in the world, I was like, I'm going to New York to activate, you know, in these ways and make a life for myself. And immediately fell into just an incredible group of people, activists, culture creators around downtown New York activism scene in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was groups like Reclaim the Streets, which I was very much involved in, More Gardens, which was fighting to protect the gardens across the city in the South Bronx, in the East Village and around. Time's Up, which was doing the big critical mass bike rides, taking over the street, advocating for, you know, more sustainable approach to transportation, of bike rights, of like just no cars, you know. And it was an incredibly fertile time, and we did huge protests, street party protests, taking over street corners with marching bands and huge puppets and celebration. And the idea, kind of building off some of the energies of ACT UP, the gay rights activism group, was to create a protest movement that was so was so built on celebration and excitement, and that people would be called to join us in the streets rather than like shouting out at them about what's wrong, really inviting them into the world that we want to see, the world that we wanted to create. And for several years, it was just an incredible community. I mean, we were in DC during a lot of the protests around the World Bank and IMF stuff. There's a lot of global trade issues that we're now seeing the ramifications of or being decided. The WTO protests in Seattle, getting arrested many, many times in New York City in a way that felt like, you know, it was so eye-opening, going through the system and seeing why people get arrested and seeing kind of the racial dynamics from the inside of what happens when people are arrested and who's getting arrested for what, and starting to understand kind of this systemic race policy and how it plays out in real people's lives, and talking to them in the jails, which is life-changing and something I highly recommend for people to experience if they can. And it was just this incredibly fertile, growing movement, and a great thing to do in that time of life. Until went full deep in, dedicated my entire year of 2004, when the war was raging in Iraq and Bush was seeking to be reelected, and the Republicans decided to hold their convention in New York City in such a cynical, exploitive way of exploiting the tragedy of September 11th for their political gains. And it was so naked in a way that seemed shocking. Their entire platform and agenda was absolutely antithetical to everything that New York City that I knew stood for in terms of housing rights, gay rights, economic justice, everything. And these people were coming to our town to further that agenda, their regressive agenda. And so I spent a year of my life organizing protests with many, many amazing people around that. And we had a huge, we were super well funded. We had a huge turnout. It felt like all the momentum was on our side, and we were going to really speak truth to power and have this moment that was going to, change things. And when the week came and the Republicans infested our city, the opposite happened. We just got arrested en masse in ways that we'd never seen before.
Was it brutal?
It was brutal. It was illegal. There's still, the lawsuits are still getting settled, but it was explicitly illegal. The cities had to settle millions of dollars in lawsuits from it. And they just stomped our message. There was, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And, there was press coverage of it, but the Republican message prevailed. I remember realizing when we lost the week and lost the moment, Giuliani was quoted on the cover of the New York Post, which is has its own bias history, but he said, the people of the United States owe it to the victims of September 11th to re-elect George W. Bush. And it was such a grotesque statement that carried the day and carried so far, when there's all these diverse voices saying the exact opposite of that, like the people of the United States and the victims of September 11th and the city itself deserves an agenda and people who represent this country that are almost the opposite of what we had.
Yeah.
And it was heartbreaking, and it was so, it burnt a lot of us out, that era.
I was in DC actually, that during that 6 months, interning for a congressman and working on the Kerry campaign.
Yeah.
And Maryland, the Democrats did pretty well in Maryland. I was working for he's now a senator, but a congressman from Maryland. So Maryland did okay, the Democrats, for that election, but the whole thing was so depressing. And I went out canvassing for Kerry. I had guns waved at me, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
And it's it's almost like there's this hot plate of getting involved in American electoral politics, where I think a lot of the young people got excited about Bernie Sanders, and it burns your hand. And it doesn't mean we should absolutely do. Voting is incredibly important. I do believe that with everything that's happening in the country. But I think there's more life-fulfilling ways of creating political change. And coming out of that experience, I was like, there's other ways to approach social justice and social change, and I'm going to explore those ways and try to do things in something that feels more regenerative, both in the process and hopefully in the outcome.
Because it's interesting. I want to come back to what these ways might look and feel like, but I feel like this point is really important, of what happens when you do go into the system. I worked in politics for a while, and I kept going back, trying to, and I kept seeing the same things, and I kept being hurt by it.
Yeah.
And for me, the culmination was in 2011, we had a referendum in the UK to change our voting system so it would be more fair. We have a system called First Past the Post, and we were looking at changing it to the alternative vote, which isn't quite proportional representation, but it's very far on the way. And the whole thing, because I was inside the campaign, I was a spokesperson for it, they didn't let me on any media, even though I was the official, me and another man were the official spokespeople for the campaign, because we wanted it to be about people and voting rights and democracy. But the media was wanting it to be about an infight between the coalition government of the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. So they just wanted politicians talking about it to keep it boring. And it was, I didn't do one media interview until after we'd lost. And the messaging that was coming out from the No campaign was so gross and misleading. Pictures of babies on life support machines, huge billboards with these babies on life support machines, somehow insinuating that if you voted yes and we changed our voting system, that these babies were going to die. And it's what?
Yeah.
But then messaging is so powerful.
Yeah. I mean,
And
look at Brexit,
yeah.
and the last election in the United States. Same thing.
Yeah.
Like, how can anyone believe these things? But those
Yeah.
images apparently work.
They work because we, no matter how much our eyes are open, it's so we take on so much subconscious messaging, and fear is so powerful. And we all have fear in us innately, and it's so powerful when that's used to grasp, and it's used so much in our world. It's used to sell us stuff all the time. It's used to push through agendas, and it's, for me, that's partly why I kind of left, this is my political work now, like having these conversations, because I want us to move out of that place of fear and become so rooted in our sense of loving security that we're able to see through this stuff and make better choices.
Yeah.
And it's a long road, but that's where I feel right now. But I feel like it's just so important to hammer at that point. Like, it's not just like, oh, politics is boring, or it's dark, or it's it's actually hitting the same place that consumerism is hitting. It's hitting our fear.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's all these pathways to creating kind of social evolution. And the political one it's like a consumer. It feels so clear, like, okay, this vote's going to happen, and if people just know the truth, then I'll move forward in this big dramatic shift. And sometimes it does happen that way. Often it doesn't. And the last election in the United States was so shocking, but not surprising in some ways. Like, here's a person whose own biographer thinks he's a sociopath. Like, the man who wrote his biography, co-wrote his autobiography with him, his ghost wrote it, thinks he's a sociopath who, a week before the election, bragged about molesting women. No one was confused about who this person was, and still millions of people voted for him. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won enough of the vote that he's now, the president. And it kind of dispelled this myth of, if people just know the truth, then they will take, the progressive course of action, which isn't necessarily true. And like, realizing that is hugely dispiriting. So I think there's some other approaches besides just like hard facts and, that kind of academic truth approach, or, and I think it's the cultural approach of these kind of conversations, of creating moments of connections with people. And it's not a linear, like, okay, this thing leads to like this better outcome, or kind of this social movement. But I choose to believe, and I'm kind of like reoriented my life around the idea that it's these smaller, softer moments that I hope can build more of a sustainable spiraling up, a more sustainable evolution for all of us. It's the best solution I have. I wish there was something more clear and direct. I just haven't seen it for myself yet. And so it's this moment that kind of hope, maybe a few people will hear something here that they found helpful, and we continue to kind of like move forward.
Where, for somebody listening that wants to use their energy to be part of a sea change, where do you feel like it's best placed?
I wish someone had said to me in my 20s, this thing that sounds so cliche, but I think it's said the right way, people can really hear it. It's, you have to be true to the most essential parts of yourself. If something feels like not, physically not like good in your body, like there's a lot of stuff I did in my activism days and like other projects that you just feel the stress and trauma, and like I was like fighting through this thing, trying to pull this boulder up the mountain because a boulder needed to be on top of the mountain, and denying other parts of like what was calling me, because I didn't feel like that was like this essential thing that needed to happen in the world. And I think if I was, in better communion with myself and in more flow with who I was and what my talents and skills were, and what, the world, universe, whatever universal energy was calling me to be, then I think it could have affected more change than even those times when I was really fighting the good fight. And I think learning that as young in as deeply as you can through whatever means you can is essential.
And also forgiving yourself when you think you learnt it, and then you find yourself in a situation that proves to you that you haven't yet fully embodied that.
Absolutely, it's a life lesson. And also forgiving yourself if you're called to be a writer, but like you're not writing things that are like freeing all the peoples and doing all the things and saving the planet. Forgiving yourself for maybe not saving the planet with that poem or book or song that you're writing, but trusting like it's hopefully it's leading to something. It's building something. It's that like slow, imperfect spiraling up. And just trusting like, the feelings inside that like really are essential.
I love this, the slow, imperfect spiraling up.
Yeah, I think, in my youth I felt like there's just like this linear path. If I just force this thing, if I just force with all the people around me who are also trying to force this thing to be the way that we think it should be, and it broke us. And the being broken was hugely difficult. I went through a very challenging part of my life that was dark and in the lower spaces, the sunken places, people say. And I've been coming out of that the past few years, and I think maybe that process is important for creative growth and everything else. I'm kind of glad now, being on the other side, that I've experienced it.
And for understanding where we are,
yeah.
like on the planet and what's happening. Like, I don't know if it's possible to not feel the pain. Like,
Yeah.
there is so much pain.
Yeah. And I'm just coming out of it now in my upper 30s, which feels late, but maybe it's fine. And I would just, I would wish for everyone who's in their 20s now to not feel that pain, but maybe it's necessary. Maybe it's part of the process.
Well, maybe, it's necessary to touch it, not necessarily to spend years in it as you and I did.
Hopefully, yeah. And just like, I do feel like the younger generation now is more in touch with something. I meet so many young people, in their teens and 20s who are just so, strong internally and fired up in this way that is like pretty astounding. And I feel incredibly inspired and rejuvenated by the energy of these generations coming online, and just remembering like this evolution is like a slow process, but it continues. The kids today are like brilliant and doing brilliant things, and imperfect, and they're doing stupid things too, but like, and the kids tomorrow will be, hopefully another couple steps along the road. And that's part of the process.
Yeah, I guess we all bring in like new information, like when we're born into the world, and that is able to hold what's happening in the world, right?
Yeah. And we all stand on the shoulders of the people before us. Like, I got so much inspiration from the civil rights leaders of my father's age and before that, and for the activists in the 80s who are fighting, against nuclear proliferation and AIDS activism and all that, and then, lent my own voice to like this era, as small as as small as my voice might have been, and hopefully I have more to say in the future, and hopefully the kids who come after me will feel some inspiration from everything that came before. And if I could be a small part of that, awesome. If I'm not, that's awesome, and probably what's going to happen. But
it sounds like you already have been.
That's the thing we hope for, but really it's about like being a community that kind of like we all evolve forward together, and all our voices like kind of come into some kind of harmonious something, imperfect as our harmony might be, but go somewhere. And I think our stories, are just beginning to be told, like you and me in particular, in this age of our lives. I feel this time that I spent here in Bali, and the Vipassana meditation I just completed is like a birthing into the next era, and appreciating everything that I've had coming so far, and humbly and stepping into what the potential is to come.
Do you have a daily practice that keeps you rooted to all of this, especially when you're in New York?
Yeah, I find Vipassana meditation is extremely helpful to me. Exercise also is extremely helpful. Like, I'm learning more now than I ever have. I'm a computer person, so I spend a lot of time at the desk, and the way your body embodies a shape and a being affects your mind and everything else. I used to think those two things were very separate, but now I'm fully appreciating the body intelligence. So just moving my system, I practice 5 rhythms, which is like a kind of a dance meditation, ecstatic dance when I'm in Bali or in Oakland and in New York. And all these things kind of help to regulate the rhythms and getting out of the city and into the green of a place like this island, as well as upstate in California. I spent time in the redwoods, which is incredibly rejuvenating, and finding those places of sanctuary.
And luckily, you guys managed to save those community gardens.
Yeah, there's
across
some gardens
New York
in the
City
that
so
are pretty special.
Yeah, I was reading something recently where somebody, I think a journalist, had been given Obama's schedule to do some piece of research and was shocked at how much exercise he did a day. I don't know how many hours, but in that way that a lot of us would be like, but I'm president, I don't have time to exercise.
Yeah.
And I know that's part of my shadow, is like I feel like the pressure, and then I don't take that time of exercising.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us were convinced like it's all about the mind, and anything that's not the mind is a waste of time. And I think maybe Obama's on something where like the mind and body are essential, and maybe that's how he's kept his incredible cool through 8 years of some crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen any president recently who's gone 8 years with like no scandal and no issues, especially now.
Yeah.
And I think being in touch with your body is really important.
And he's kept a gentleness and a toughness and heart
Yeah, compassion.
and a great relationship.
With his partner.
Everybody, sees that relationship.
Yeah.
And
Just on the inside of everything, there's complexities, but just
of course.
the contrast of him who came before him and who came after him is so stark. And I think there's some lessons to be learned there.
To finish with, I wonder what your feelings are on how vital it is to have our creativity alive, as well as our sense of the world that we live in and how we're contributing to it on a political way and the environmental way. Our connection to spirit we've discussed in various ways. But what is the importance that you feel of creativity?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of give a caveat to everything I'm about to say by saying, creativity alone will not save the world, and I'm under no delusions of that. That said, I think if you're a creative person, if there's a spark, a fire inside of you, that no matter what you do, just is always there, always sparkling, always this source of heat, whether you like it or not, you have to pay attention to that. You have to tend that fire. If it goes out, you lose yourself, you lose everything, or it could consume you. And if you're feeling that as you're like listening to this interview, if you're feeling that through your days and nights,
and it's painful when you feel it and you're not acting in it.
It's painful. You feel when you're being untrue to that fire, and I've been through many, many years of trying to deny that fire, and it didn't work well for me. And so being true to that creative, like, kind of fire inside for me has been essential. And it's not been a linear path, and it's not been consistent. I feel like I've grown a lot in that, in respecting my creative energies and what can come from it. And I think there's a lot more to come. It's a life learning of like how to channel that into a greater good for myself and for the people immediately around me and the wider community and hopefully the planet as a whole. I trust that it will get to a place where those youthful ideas and all the things I was in the streets about in my 20s will also be furthered by the creative energies that I put out in the world, even if it's not totally clear in the moments of how those two things connect. So I think it's absolutely essential when you feel that creative fire inside to be true to that. Doesn't mean it's going to save the world, but it might save you, and that could be just as important.
Is there such a thing as a not creative person?
To be really honest, I think there's people who feel creative on different levels, and I think that's okay. And I think people express themselves in all different kinds of ways, and I don't think we need everybody to be, speaking in the same or singing in the same songs. Some people, seeing in different methods. You know, like we're all a little mathematical, but we're not all mathematicians, you know?
Mm-hmm. So it's also about really listening to the way that creativity is you know, speaking through you, singing through you.
Exactly. Yeah, and being true to that, whatever that method mode is for you.
And it might be in the food you cook, or the way that you organize your bookshelf, or it might be that you have to create some sort of art.
Fatherhood or motherhood or the business you create or whatever it is, but you know, that spark inside that speaks to you. We all have something inside of us that feels like it's essential. Being true to that. I do think being a true artist, creative, is something that is not universal, and I think that's okay. You know, I think accountants can be great accountants. I think mathematicians can be great mathematicians, and there is art to all of those things. But people who are feel some like creative artistic inspiration should really cherish that, even if it's not clear that it's going to be rewarded. You know, and it's a special path.
Yeah, I spent 7 years denying mine, and I was so unhappy. I drank so much as well during that 7 years.
Yeah. For me too, when I was denying myself, alcohol became, you know, a constant challenge. It was the easiest way to numb that kind of essential voice inside, and that does not work for very well, or at all.
And then also because, you know, in a lot of the creative industries, there's a lot of alcohol, so it's sort of a way of partaking. You get to hang out with creative people, but feeling slight deadness.
Yeah. And again, practices like meditation and exercise for me has been a huge part of, you know, keeping me grounded in myself and my physical being. That's kind of shifted my relationship to alcohol in particular. You know, just different habits of ways that have not been most regenerative and healthy.
Do you drink now?
Not very, very rarely. So I don't feel like I need to avoid alcohol in order to like a plague, but it does not make me feel good.
Yeah.
So if I'm at a wedding or an event, like I will like have a glass of wine with people, but I feel pretty gross immediately. And it's interesting. It's completely stopped drinking for about 6 years, and I think it changed the chemical reaction in my body where it's like it doesn't feel great for me anymore, and I don't think it ever will.
Yeah, I had a similar process. I stopped drinking. It was quite painful at first, and you know, and then I started to replace that time with 5 rhythms, ecstatic dance. Like I found these other ways to connect to myself and to other people, and to open up some energy and to, you know, release. And now I never felt the need to be, I'm not drinking, you know, I'm an alcoholic. Although I did go to an AA meeting just to see, and I resonated with what they were saying when they did the list of like, how has alcohol affected you? I was like, yep, and everyone I know, like I can pinpoint some of these things in the way that alcohol plays out in their relationships and relationship with themselves and their work and their contribution to the world. But I didn't feel that was necessary. It felt more like the changing of the habits, and then it sort of happened by itself. And now when I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I'll have a drink, and it doesn't ever feel that good as the imagination is like, oh, this could be fun.
Yeah.
But that's okay too.
Yeah.
It's
it might just be part of us like growing.
Maybe, or maybe it is just a thing of whatever you feed yourself is what your body gets used to, your system gets used to.
Absolutely.
And so if you feed yourself with things that you know, like when I think about the days that I used to drink a lot, like it's crazy, like the hangovers, and yet how I would then rally myself out of the hangovers to drink more, and that was like the primary objective. And it was completely like just normal in my community and my society, like it didn't feel like I was doing anything crazy. But then I noticed on the other hand that, you know, the more yoga I practice, the more yoga I want to practice. more I dance, the more my body craves to dance.
Mm-hmm.
The more I eat like nice, nourishing food, the more I want it.
It's like rewiring the circuits, you know, and like creating new pathways, which is literally what's happening. We're creating new neural pathways that are like leading your whole system to, you know, a different place.
And it's so powerful that we can do that.
Yeah. And it's like a great metaphor. Like we could do that inside of our bodies and minds, and we can do that as a society and a culture and a planet. You know, I'm incredibly optimistic always about humanity in general. Like having my father come from his very humble beginnings to where we are now, I see the progressions, and I've seen it in my family. And as urgent as everything feels now, we are in a great place as humanity. And I think this is like I think we are evolving up. And I think we're reprogramming, you know, ourselves, and it's a, you know, grotesque at times process and an imperfect process, but it is something that's moving forward. It's like, you know, when we're both coming out of our, you know, party days, it's not an easy process, and it sometimes does not feel like evolution, but it, you know, as we slowly do move into the next stage, and I think that's true for, you know, humanity as a whole. I think, you know, at least I hope so.
Yeah. Wow, what a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
How do we find out more about your work? We'll post links for everyone in the show notes.
Yeah, the best place is just, if you're interested in the You Are So Lucky events, it's youaresolucky.com. Or I can be found at a new project I'm doing with my partner, Alexandra.
Who is wonderful.
Who's outside right now. And that's at williamxalexandra.com, and you can kind of see more of our other projects, which we're very excited about. Not quite ready to announce, but some very interesting things are coming this year.
I'm very excited about, feeling and experiencing what emerges there.
Thank you. We are too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our community. If you loved this and would like to contribute to our Patreon campaign or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes so we can grow. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together.